So here you are in a philosophy course, and you are probably wondering, what is this course actually all about? I'm sure you've heard the word philosophy many times in your life. People will talk about having a personal philosophy. People will refer to having philosophical differences. But that doesn't really help us to understand what is truly meant when we're talking about the discipline of philosophy. So what I am going to attempt to do in this podcast is to lay out what we mean by philosophy when we are referring to it specifically as an academic discipline. First of all, a little bit of history about philosophy. In many ways, you can trace the history of philosophy all the way back to the origins of the human species, because philosophy is actually something that begins with the birth of consciousness. It begins with the birth of people's ability to think. And so you will find traces of philosophy way back in ancient cultures, even before people were able to write in their various oral traditions. I think the fact that what gives rise to philosophy is the human ability to think, to be a conscious self, really gives us a keen insight into what philosophy ultimately is all about. Because notice that first and foremost, it is rooted in the human ability to think. And you'll notice in your text, for example, that when Aristotle is unpacking the notion of philosophy, he roots it in the notion that we are rational animals. This capacity to be rational, if you really stop to think about it, is quite amazing. What it says is that you and I can actually reflect on the world around us and reflect on ourselves, our own position in that world. We can actually become consciously aware, not just of the world around us, but of how we kind of figure into it, what it means to be a human person in this world and, of course, ultimately in this universe. If you look at some of the other definitions that are offered in your text, you'll notice that the very word philosophy, when people started to use this word to describe what they were doing when they were being rational animals, trying to figure out the world around them and their own selves within that world, that they came up with this word philosophy, which can be broken down to two ancient Greek words. So the word philosophia can be broken down to the word philein, which means to love. You can think of other words that have a similar root. Philadelphia, for example, the city of brotherly love. And Sophia, which means wisdom. Now what we just did here was we just used etymology. Etymology has to do with discovering the ancient origins of the words that we use. And we're going to do that a lot in this course, because when we do that, it actually clarifies the original meaning of that word. You know, words, of course, can change over time, and sometimes we can even kind of obscure the original meaning because of these changes. But it's always helpful just to kind of gain a sense of clarity in our own minds, to go back to the most ancient roots of a word, to try to understand it more precisely. So as you look at different words, I invite you to always consider looking at the etymology of that word. You'll be surprised at the new insights that that can give you. I also want to point out that in the text it talks a little bit about some of that history of philosophy, particularly in ancient Greece. And it refers to a time period that is known as the pre-Socratic time period. And so if you'll notice, during the pre-Socratic, so that is the time before Socrates, a great philosopher who we will actually deal with a little bit this semester, that before that time there were some unique sets of questions. But then you'll also notice that it refers to a group of people known as the Sophists, and then of course it also refers to Socrates himself. Now it points this out because it wants to point out that this notion of loving wisdom is kind of tricky, because really if you stop to think about it, what is wisdom? Once you come to a definition of wisdom, then you have to ask the question, what does it mean to love it? So you'll notice that for the pre-Socratics, wisdom is knowledge about the physical universe around them, and it's obtained by investigating the universe. Isn't this exactly what we do in contemporary sciences now? For the Sophists, wisdom is the possession of a kind of excellence, what is referred to as virtue, and it can be obtained by learning the skills necessary to be successful in public life. So you're going to notice that for the Sophists, one of their chief goals is to try to understand how do we live together in a cohesive, peaceful, harmonious way. What are some of the cooperative virtues that we need to instill in ourselves and in each other so that we can actually have a public, or what we refer to as a civic, life together? These concerns, of course, are taken up in what we now call today political science. For Socrates himself, wisdom is the awareness of ignorance. And so for Socrates himself, one of the big things that he does is he challenges the status quo by getting people to question what is it that they in fact know. And if you stop and think about that question, you come to realize that in fact we don't know very much. What we must always be keenly aware of is our own ignorance. And what that means is that we always need to critically examine our beliefs. Don't just take beliefs at face value. Don't just take beliefs that are handed down one generation to the next. For Socrates, using our own rational capacity is paramount. We must critically examine what we believe and why we believe it. So for Socrates, as an example, he would go around ancient Greece and he would ask people, he would say, what is it that you mean by justice? And for some people, this question can be quite upsetting because they were told to believe one thing, but upon further examination, they realized, wait a minute, there's no real basis for my belief. I am believing something merely because other people believe it, and therefore I need to challenge some of my assumptions upon which that belief rests. As soon as we start doing this, we upset the apple cart. And as a matter of fact, for Socrates, because he did this, especially with young people, and therefore young people were less than willing to simply accept the standard beliefs that were given down to them, and they became freer individuals who began to realize that their own belief systems might actually challenge some of the political structures even of their time. For that reason, Socrates was put to death. In the response to this podcast that follows, I am going to ask for you to reflect on the phrase, thinking is dangerous. Now, what I just said about Socrates should give you some insight as to why I'm asking for you to reflect on that phrase. The other point that I want to just highlight is Aristotle's phrase that philosophy begins in wonder. As a matter of fact, you'll notice that I even have a little picture of a statue of a young Aristotle. And I really rather like that statue just because I think it shows that here's this young person and he's sitting there and he's just wondering. He's wondering about the world around him, wondering about all different kinds of questions. And I think if you can capture that spirit, if you can capture the spirit of the young person who is looking at this world and everything is kind of new and you're wondering, why is it here? What does it mean to be in this world? How can I get along in this world in a good way? I mean, we can wonder about a billion different questions. And if you really get on board with this course, I think those questions are fascinating. I think the experience of wonderment is a wonderful experience. I want to point out this quote that I use here, this quote that says, "We find ourselves believing things that we do not understand." This is perhaps strange to say, but it is true. There are many very basic beliefs we have about God, ourselves, the natural world, human society, and human productions, all these things that we do. But all too often, we fail to understand what it is we believe, and we fail to understand why we believe it. We have questions about meaning of our beliefs, and questions about the justification or the rationality of our beliefs. And we, many of us, dislike not understanding. I hope that each and every one of you dislike not understanding. If you start from that place where you say, I want to understand, I want to wonder about all of these different questions that we have, questions that surround us, I think you're really going to enjoy this semester. So we move to another question, and that is the question, what are the concerns of philosophy? And you'll notice that philosophers are usually concerned with some particular concepts such as existence or being. They're concerned with questions around morality or goodness, why it is we say that something is wrong or that something is good or bad. About knowledge, what can we know and not know? About truth, what does it mean to say that something is true? What is the basis for determining that it is true? And even beauty, what is it to say that something is beautiful? Historically, most philosophy has either centered around religious beliefs or on science. So, as I already stated, the pre-Socratics looked at the natural world around them. But when philosophy really kind of reached its high point, it was also looking very much at beliefs that could be considered religious in nature. And for that reason, you're going to notice that philosophy and theology worked really hand in glove. And they worked hand in glove all the way up through until the modern time period when they began to be separated. They began to be separated during a time period, for example, known as the Enlightenment, during which you had various philosophers who proclaimed that there is no God. And yet we can still ask all of these really deep questions about what it means to exist. So that separation from God would, of course, separate it from theology. Theology dealing with words about God. Note that the next section, the next lecture actually that I'm going to be giving to you after you respond to this lecture, deals with the various types of questions that philosophers ask, and those can be categorized under three main concepts: metaphysics, epistemology, and axiology. One final point that I want to make in this lecture, though, is that we are doing philosophy from a multicultural perspective. We're, in other words, covering philosophy from what we refer to as Eastern philosophy to Western philosophy. I want you to be familiar with what is meant by those terms. So if we say that something is rooted in Eastern philosophy, we are referring very broadly to the various philosophical systems of Asia. And the development of those major Eastern philosophical traditions occurred primarily in India, China, and Japan. So you'll notice, for instance, within the next few weeks, you will be studying different thinkers such as Confucius and the Buddha, and thoughts that were put forth in the Bhagavad Gita. None of those might be familiar with you right now, but they will be familiar to you in the next few weeks. And when we are doing that, we are doing Eastern philosophy. But we will also be looking at Western philosophy. Western philosophy, as I've already mentioned, essentially began in ancient Greece, at least as a more formal way of thinking, and it includes the predominant philosophical thinking of Europe and its former colonies up to the present day. I think it's really exciting to be able to do philosophy from a multicultural perspective. It's one of the reasons why I ask for you to purchase the textbook that you have. If you'll notice, the very title of that textbook says Voices of Wisdom. And what I like in particular about that textbook is that it takes voices from around the globe. So it doesn't just look at one particular population. It says that wisdom somehow has been spoken in all of these different cultures and all of these different times. You're going to see similarities among some of them, and you're going to see some vast differences. But all of them are very enriching to consider.